Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, December 21st, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the 2024 presidential election in a matchup between President Joe Biden and President Donald Trump. Now, this matchup is one that I think many people have been hoping would not come to fruition as we've looked for the next upcoming election cycle. Donald Trump announcing his bid back in mid-November 2022, just a month ago, actually. It seems like a long time ago, immediately following the abysmal midterm elections for the Republican Party. Now, with Donald Trump's announcement in his candidacy for re-election, many people have been expecting Joe Biden to also step back into the ring. That was combined with a very good showing for Democrats in the midterm elections, expanding in the Senate, narrowly losing the House, which is ultimately still a loss, but Democrats were definitely expecting 30 to 40 pickups for the GOP. They got just 10 pickups across the country. So with that combined, Joe Biden's approval rating is now on the rise, and many Democrats are calling on the former or the incumbent president. I keep thinking the former vice president. That's no longer the way we refer to him. The president, Joe Biden, to run for re-election. Now, at face value, a repeat election is not something that voters seem to be super enthusiastic about. I will say that in terms of general election polling, both candidates are roughly in the low 40s, which isn't where you need to be in order to win an election. Now, this isn't to say that third-party candidates or there are that many undecided voters. I just then generally think that of those who are being polled, they are so unenthusiastic about voting for either of these two candidates at this point that they really don't want to be in a position where this matchup is possible, where they'll say they're undecided or simply don't know. But realistically, most of these voters do have a general idea, and it looks like they're breaking for Joe Biden, even with the undecideds taken into account. Now, Joe Biden's 2-point margin of victory is not all that impressive, but I will say that I have been surprised to see the Democratic Party's performance despite Joe Biden's approval rating being in the negative. Right now, it stands around -8 nationwide in Real Clear Politics. It's roughly the same. That's not the right thing, but it is roughly the same on Real Clear Politics. But another thing that I will say that really shows the lack of enthusiasm for a repeat election such as this one is that even on the Republican side, I think Democrats, if Joe Biden was to run, would be entirely fine renominating him because he is the incumbent. He has some type of mandate to run for re-election. But on the Republican side, Donald Trump being at 47% doesn't exactly cut it for me. I'm looking at this and saying, why is it that a former president is not even getting the majority of his previous constituents, a majority of his previous Republican voters, and a governor like Ron DeSantis from Florida is nearly there. 18 points behind is not at all a bad starting point when you have not even announced your bid, whereas the other candidate, the former president, already has. So that seems to indicate that voters aren't exactly super enthusiastic about voting for either of these two nominees. But I will say that most of the states are going to vote roughly the same. I think our expectations here really are limited down to just the midterm, swing states that we have to take a look at and really consider for this election cycle. What we will find is that most of these states will be considered to be safe for the GOP. I will say that I could be convinced to seeing a state such as South Carolina or Montana narrow down to being likely states, but it really doesn't make much of a difference. I think that's not the focus of this video, and it's not really what I want the focus of the video to be. I'd rather just focus on where Democrats are and in terms of electability, where Joe Biden is, where Donald Trump is in these swing states, in the states that truly matter the most. So what I have done so far is characterize all of the states that I think would be safe and locked down for the Republican Party. I think Alaska is a bit iffy here. I think we could argue that one's going to be likely, but I won't say that it's a swing state. I think maybe in the future, I think we could see Alaska. I talked about this as a sleeper state last election cycle. Alaska definitely can be competitive and probably will be competitive in the future. We've seen it now with Mary Peltola. Democrats absolutely can win in this state. It just takes the right type of Democrat, and I don't think that's going to be Joe Biden, especially on the presidential level. I don't think Alaska's ready to go just yet. But where we are right now is Democrats being at 181, Republicans at 125. They really don't lock down that many electoral votes anymore when it comes down to safe states. And honestly, it's what we should expect. Realistically, neither of these two parties are going to reach 270 outright, so it does come down to very populous states. But we do have these states called likely states, where we have a general idea of how they're going to go. So I think Donald Trump, considering his last election performance, did quite well in states such as Florida, in states such as Texas. He still ultimately ended up winning them, but he really shined in Florida, Iowa, and Ohio, states that I think, if given the opportunity again to vote between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, would still vote the same way, would still very much be at least in Iowa and Ohio, likely red states. And I think we can cross those off our list. And that brings the Republican Party to 148. Now, that brings us down to about 209 remaining electoral votes, but Democrats on the flip side have their own likely blue states. Joe Biden absolutely has them as well. And I'd go so far as to argue a state such as Colorado can now be a safe state for the Democratic Party. I don't think it's going to be narrower than where it was back in 2020. I do think that you are going to see some improvements for President Biden in some of these battleground states, whereas previously, I don't know if I believed that. It was very difficult for me to understand how Democrats could do even remotely well with an approval rating so cataclysmic nationwide, but ultimately voters don't seem to be taking it too much to heart. And what we know from prior nominees and prior Democrats is that it doesn't always take the approval rating to tank your campaign. Sometimes it can be that, sometimes it isn't that, and sometimes it doesn't even matter. And I think 2012 and 2022, both 10 years apart, or 10 years apart, not both, show that a approval rating isn't always an indicator of an election performance. So, with 199 remaining toss-up electoral votes, I'd actually characterize Colorado as a safe state. Michael Bennet just won here by 15 points when the margin should narrow up. We have found this state to be increasingly more Democratic as the years go on, and it looks like that trend will continue into 2024. I think against Trump, Virginia votes a very similar way as it did before. The state of Maine votes a very similar way as it did before. I don't know why I had Maine's 2nd district as the safe one. I meant to do it with the 1st district was going too quickly for my own good. Minnesota, I think, would be a likely blue state. New Mexico, also a likely blue state. I really just don't see things coming in too strong or too hot for the former president, especially if his party is now willing to abandon him. I think it was very different when there was a clear and consolidated effort, at least so it seemed, in early 2021, late 2021, and even parts of early 2022, where there seemed to be this group of Republicans, those who could have considered a bid, Nikki Haley, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, some of which actually came out and said, Nikki Haley said this explicitly, that should Donald Trump run for president, I wouldn't challenge him. That they would remove themselves from the race and vie for the presidency another year or potentially never at all. And I think that really showed me at least what the Republican Party was willing to do in favor of Trump, what they were willing to do in order to win that election. They wanted to consolidate efforts around the former president, and at the time, it looked like that might be a good move, right? You know, at the time, it looked like Donald Trump could have been able to win back over American voters because Joe Biden was unpopular. Democrats were on track to lose the election in a landslide in November. Roe v. Wade was intact. There wasn't really much indicating that the American public was turning on the Republican Party, but rather that they were very happy with a Republican potential turnover, that they would be happy going into 2024 as well, even if it meant re-electing President Donald Trump. But I no longer think that is the case. And that's why states such as Colorado, Virginia, New Mexico, Minnesota are all states, and Maine, that I think would be more left-wing this time than they were previously. And I think that is fundamentally the problem with Donald Trump being on this ballot again. Now, don't get me wrong, Donald Trump still wins in some of these battleground states. I think he does take away a victory in the state of Texas. I think that one would be a lean red state. The reason for the lean red state, well, number one, there's not exactly anything here convincing many of these voters to vote for Trump. It's a growing state. The metro areas are growing across the state. And ultimately, we are finding that Democrats are increasing their advantage. Even against Beto O'Rourke, someone who actually, let's not get into it, but I do think that Beto O'Rourke has finished off a lot of his political career in Texas, at least for the immediate future. I think depending on where it goes in the future, he could return. But Beto O'Rourke running against Greg Abbott, sure, it was a good campaign, but Greg Abbott's performance was quite worrisome for the GOP. Even though Greg Abbott won by nearly double digits, it still put Republicans in a position where they were underperforming, even in an election like 2018, where Democrats had a phenomenal election nationwide, and Texas was still about a 15-point margin of victory for Greg Abbott, narrowed down to 6 points for Trump in the 2020 election. But if Greg Abbott was able to win by 15 in a blue wave year, a year significantly better, 12 points, might I tell you, 12 points to the right of the nation from where it was in 2018. If a national environment that was 12 points more to the right, you would have imagined Texas would be a 30-point margin of victory, but instead it narrowed down. Right, and I think that consistent trend is something that we will see limiting the way for Democrats to win limiting the way Republicans have won in Texas. I think they will still win for probably through 2028, but I think it'll be closer. And I think at this point in time, what we have seen from the Republican Party in Texas is that their grip is loosening, and Democrats are starting to pry away the trophy from them. So Texas right now, still a Trump state. Still Trump defeats Biden. It's still fundamentally a red state. but it's getting more and more purple, and eventually it might become bluer, bluer, and bluer, the same way Arizona and Georgia have. So speaking of those states, let's go ahead and talk about them briefly. I think Arizona and Georgia are ones that were extremely competitive in 2020. I mean, I know they were extremely competitive, both less than half a percentage point, and both of them I think would be states that Joe Biden wins by a lean margin. I think we're going to fill out the Sun Belt here before we get into the Midwest. Georgia, Arizona states that I truly believe Joe Biden would be on track to win by a larger margin. Warnock Kelly proved it, that even in adverse environments, given a candidate that is of similar stature to Donald Trump, you are going to find, at least policy-wise, Democrats do well, and I think that's exactly what's going to happen here. Blake Masters was an iteration of Trump. Herschel Walker was an iteration of Trump. These are people that were replicas, they were clones, they were decoys, in essence, and they were proxy battles between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and ultimately, Joe Biden won in these midterm elections. Democrats won in these midterm elections against these wannabe Trump figures. And I don't say that to demean them as candidates, but more so that they were, in practically every way, trying to be the next embodiment of Trump. See Carrie Lake, for instance, who probably would have ran for president should she had won that governorship in Arizona. But Arizona, Georgia states that would be, that are going to be lean blue states in a Joe Biden, Donald Trump matchup. But that, again, isn't to say that Donald Trump doesn't have his own states as well. I think Florida would be a lean state. I don't think it would be this large margin that Ron DeSantis or Marco Rubio were able to win by. I don't think Trump is that popular in this state. I think Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio appealed to a very, very strong group of voters, Hispanic voters in Miami-Dade, Hispanic voters in Broward County, won over a lot of the Democratic Party that would vote for a Democrat absolutely on the national level, but these figures were very popular. Donald Trump, on the other hand, is not so popular, and I can imagine after all of this possibility that Ron DeSantis would challenge him in the state, and him losing to Ron DeSantis in head-to-head polls tells me that his base isn't even enthusiastic to vote for him anymore. Florida was a very solid state for Trump back in 2016, defeated even Senator Marco Rubio in that primary, and I honestly don't think that would be the case this time around as well. So Florida, Texas, lean red states. Let's move over to the state of Nevada. I think this is one where we can comfortably say Democrats are going to win here, despite the polls and the odds in 2022 and 2020 and 2018 and 2016 and 2014 and 2012. The reason why I'm telling you that is because in every single one of those elections, literally every single one, we have seen cases where Democrats are underestimated in the polls and Republicans are expected to win, and they end up losing. So, looking at that, I will say that we are going to go into looking at Nevada from the lens of that it should be a little bit more biased in favor of Democrats in the polls because, quite frankly, historically, it has always been in favor of the GOP. So with the final remaining 66 toss-up electoral votes, let's go ahead and call this election the state of New Hampshire. I forgot to characterize as a likely blue state. Sorry about that one. I think I should have. The state of Maine's 2nd District goes down to lean red. The state of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin all move out of their close and competitive nature, and North Carolina becomes a lean blue state. Now, what's the reasoning for the Rust Belt? Well, I think also 2022 showed us that, again, President Biden's approval rating isn't going to do everything. It isn't going to tank his chances or the Democratic Party's chances in these states, and I think the solidification of Democrats in Michigan winning over the state legislature and in Pennsylvania doing the same, in Wisconsin being able to hold on to that governorship told us that there is still a pretty solid base here for Democrats. It isn't the state that we're fleeting away from the Democratic Party. I think that will come in the next few decades, but not now, not against Donald Trump in the future. In the state of North Carolina, it was so close in the last election. I think considering that Donald Trump has certainly lost support relative to 2020 before, I would have said that Joe Biden has lost support, and I think in a way he did. I think he lost support for a little bit. But now, with so much at stake, so much on the line, I do think Democrats will turn out. I think independents that would prefer Joe Biden over Donald Trump will turn out. And I think ultimately that will be what leads the Democrats to victory in this election against Donald Trump in a matchup. And in the final district, Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, we have the Democrats winning. So I think for right now, we have a map where Democrats are at 319, Republicans are at 219. Donald Trump holds on to swing states, Iowa, Ohio, Florida, Texas. Democrats win the rest. Quite literally, run the map. And I think ultimately this tells us that Joe Biden, if he was to run, would face well against Donald Trump. That Donald Trump should not be the Republican nominee for the sake of electability, but quite frankly, it looks like he's still in the lead. We don't know how much electability sways voters in and out of voting for candidates, but as of right now, my map would be 319 to 219 for President Biden defeating President Trump for 4 more years of the Democratic Party being in the White House. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.